everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today at the Part 4A of the Public Policy Engagement Masterclass Series. Today's session is on communication skills, focusing on writing for a policy audience. So just as a brief outline of what this session and the recording will be covering, first it'll cover how to prepare a written evidence submission to a select committee inquiry, followed by a presentation and discussion on policy briefs, providing some insights into the perspectives from people who've worked in government, as well as doing some group activities. I also just wanted to flag to you some upcoming events taking place as part of the Masterclass series. So on Tuesday, 15th of December, we are doing the Part 4B, which is writing for public audiences. And this will explore how to leverage social media, blogs, and the media to connect with stakeholders, disseminate research, and inform policy. And if you want to get in touch with us and find out more, do follow UCL Public Policy on Twitter. You can also shoot me an email or check out the Public Policy website. We also have a blog where we post policy-related blog pieces. And I'd also highly recommend that you subscribe to our newsletter, as this includes all sorts of information about current and live policy inquiries, select committees, and more about the UCL public policy activities. So I'd like to now hand it over to our first speaker, who is Grace, who will be covering select committee inquiries.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for joining today. It's great to be engaging with so many of you, and I work in the Office of the Vice Provost for Research. My name is Grace Gottlieb, and I'm going to talk to you about how to develop written evidence for select committee inquiries. And this is a topic that's close to my heart because over the last few years at UCL and in previous places that I've worked, I have written a lot of pieces of written evidence for select committee inquiries. So I'm glad to have picked up some tips along the way and to be able to share those with you today. So these are the topics that I'm going to cover in this session, or that we'll cover all together as well. I'll start off talking about what exactly select committees are, what they do, and then the process of select committee inquiries. I'll then move on to explore why you might want to consider submitting written evidence to an inquiry, and if you did, then how you would structure that written evidence. I'll finish off looking at where you might find out about inquiries, how you would even know that they're happening in the first place. And then we'll have a Q&A session. And after the Q&A session, we'll be doing an exercise to hopefully put the principles in this session to the test. So firstly, I'm sure, as you know, Parliament's role is to hold government accountable. And one of the ways in which Parliament does this is through the existence of select committees. And these are committees of 11 or 12 members that are in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And they essentially look at particular topics and engage with the government on those topics in order to hold the government to account and make sure that the most important things are happening in relation to those areas. Committees are slightly different in the Commons versus in the Lords. So in the Commons, there's a select committee that shadows each government department. So the idea is that, for example, the Health and Social Care Committee is intended to hold to account the Department for Health and Social Care. Whereas in the Lords, the committees, they don't always shadow, well, they don't shadow government departments, but they look into specialist subjects more often. So actually in the Lords, there are 5 permanent committees, and then there are a number of one-off committees that are set up in response to a particular issue and look into the specialist subjects as I described. So for example, at the moment, I believe there's a Lords COVID-19 committee, and in the past, there was a Lords committee on artificial intelligence. As you can see, these are very specialist subjects that the committees are focused on. Whereas in the Commons, committees tend to work throughout a whole Parliament. They're permanent in the sense that they continue as from one Parliament to the next, but within each Parliament, you have particular members that are part of a committee, and then new members are elected each time there's a new Parliament. So those are the differences between Commons and the Lords, although there are more similarities, I would say, than there are differences. So what do select committees actually do? Well, the main process by which they do their work is through doing an inquiry. And an inquiry essentially involves identifying a key issue, key topic that the committee wants to look into within the context of their remit. So for example, going back to the example of the Health and Social Care Committee, they might look at, what are the key issues in health and social care at the moment? And what should they be investigating? What's really relevant to policy and relevant to the government that they should be engaging with the government on? So the way the process works is as follows. There'll be a scoping period at the beginning whereby the committee and the staff who work for the committee, the clerks and committee specialists, for example, they will scope out potential topics for the committee to focus their inquiry on. And once they've identified a topic, they'll issue what's called a call for evidence, which is exactly as described. They're basically calling for the public, for organizations, companies, anyone to submit what's called written evidence to the inquiry, and then the committee can learn from that written evidence. So written evidence is essentially just submitting a document that sets out your views on a topic. But before I go on to that, I've got an example here of the call for evidence from the Health and Social Care Committee. So this was an inquiry on social care, funding and workforce, and it opened in March of this year. And I'm including this so you can get a sense for what these calls for evidence look like. Typically, they begin with the context. So I don't know if you can see my mouse pointer, but the first couple of paragraphs are really about the context of an inquiry, why it was set up in the first place, and you can understand the background. Then you've got what's called the terms of reference. This is here. The terms of reference sets out the specific questions that the committee is interested in finding out the answers to. So for example, here, what impact is social care funding, the social care funding situation having on the NHS? And the terms of reference, I would say, is really key if you're thinking about submitting written evidence, because it sets out the framework of the inquiry, the scope of it, and it should really be grounding you in the context of what you want to include in your written evidence. So yes, so calls for evidence are issued with a deadline normally, and so you can submit your document setting out your views in response to the questions that have been asked in the call for evidence. And after the written evidence has been submitted, then the committee will review it and then hold some oral evidence sessions. And oral evidence is basically means an interview. So they'll bring in experts, a number of sessions where they speak to either experts or government officials on the topics that they've raised, both in the terms of reference of their call for evidence, also based on the issues that might have come up in the written evidence. So they'll engage with experts to understand the key issues, and these can be quite entertaining sessions. They tend to be quite challenging because they really want to get to the heart of the matter, and particularly if they're interviewing government officials, they tend to be quite challenging and hold them to account on what's happened in a particular area. Once the oral evidence has been completed, the committee will go away and review everything that has been explored in the context of the written evidence and the oral evidence sessions, and they'll write a report which sets out the findings of the inquiry and also includes recommendations for what the government should do as a consequence of the issues that have been raised. The government then, typically a few months later, will issue a response which will directly respond to the recommendations of the committee's report, setting out, whether they're going to act on the committee's recommendations, if so, how, and if not, why not. So this is really the key point at which the government is held to account on this particular issue. But there does tend to be a limit on how many people can be invited to give oral evidence. So one of the more, I suppose, achievable outcomes that you might be aiming for is to get a citation in the committee report. And I'm going to give an example of what that might look like. So a few years ago, a Lord Select Committee was set up on artificial intelligence. And this is an excerpt from the UCL written evidence. So it says, the government should continue to pursue and enable open data initiatives. For example, data.gov.uk provides free access to data from government departments and public bodies. So this was the excerpt, and it resulted in a citation in the committee report in which they noted that a number of witnesses had advocated for more free and open access to public data sets, and they cited UCL and the fact that we'd drawn attention to a particular resource. So this, it's always nice when you get a direct citation, but one thing I would keep in mind is that it's more often that you influence the committee's thinking in a less tangible way, and it might be that the committee says, for example, things like a number of witnesses or a number of submissions raised XYZ point. And if you're not sort of explicitly mentioned with your name or your submission, that doesn't mean that you haven't influenced the way that the committee has been thinking, because often there are a number of organizations or individuals making similar points, that can really give a lot more weight behind a particular point or recommendation. So moving on from the potential outcomes that you might be looking to reach when you're submitting written evidence, let's say I've convinced you it's a good thing to do, and you've identified a call for evidence that you want to respond to, and all you have to do is now put your submission together. When I say submission, I mean a piece of written evidence. I tend to use the two terms interchangeably. So I would highly recommend starting with an executive summary of your response. I normally put these together once I've written the entire response, and then pull out some of the key points from the response and then arrange them into a coherent summary at the start in bullet point form. This should be no more than a page, because the intention here is really to be able to sort of cut through the noise. Let's say a committee has received maybe even 100 or hundreds of submissions to an inquiry. They're not going to be able to read every submission in detail. So if you pull out your absolute key points into your executive summary at the start and you make it really clear, that can be a really good way to get your key messages across, even when the committee doesn't have a lot of time to read in detail. And typically you would follow your executive summary with an introduction explaining who you are, what your expertise is, why the committee should listen to you, what is it that gives you knowledge that can be helpful to them. And you might include your contact details at that stage so that they can contact you if they have any follow-up questions or if they were interested in inviting you to give oral evidence. Then you would have the core of the response. And I would recommend structuring this under the questions in the terms of reference in the call for evidence. So let's just go back to the example we had earlier. So you can see the questions here in the terms of reference. So the way I would structure this, if I were writing a written submission to this inquiry, I would take those 4 questions and use them as the main headings in my piece of written evidence that I was writing. And the reason for this is that it just makes it a lot easier for the committee to be able to pinpoint where exactly your answers are to the specific questions that they've raised, rather than having it all sort of in one go and they can't necessarily identify as easily where you've got your answer to the first question, for example, that they've raised. And then finally, include your references at the end. I wouldn't worry too much about putting lots of effort into references. You can just include links and things. It doesn't have to be the sort of full, in-depth academic style of referencing, as long as they're able to access the particular the source. And all of this, typically, the committees request that they should be no longer than 3,000 words, which tends to be about 6 sides of A4. But sometimes there can be specific requests in the context of specific inquiries as to what the word limit or page limit is. So this is the overarching structure that I would recommend. And I should really say that this is a template that hopefully would be helpful to you if you're starting this out and perhaps you've never done it before, or you've done it a few times, but you want a template that can help you to structure it. This is not the only way that you could structure your submission. It's just a way that I have found helpful to do so in the past. So that's the macro structure. And now looking a little bit more micro at how you make your individual points and structure the text within the core of your response. So I would really recommend breaking up your text into short sentences and short paragraphs. And for example, if you have an overarching point and there are a number of subpoints within that, don't be afraid to use bullet points. The key here really is to make it as accessible, digestible as possible. And if you have sort of long, dense texts, that's just going to be quite off-putting to the committee if they're trying to really get to the core of what you're saying as quickly as possible. I would also suggest signposting, and you can do this using subheadings within the sections underneath each question. You can also use topic sentences to start off your paragraph to really summarize what you're going to get at in this paragraph. That can be really helpful for someone who's just passing through a number of responses to get a sense for what your response is about and the areas that you've got. If you do have a habit of referring back to certain bits of response, it can be helpful just to number paragraphs so that you can do this more easily. And one thing that I found quite useful, since in my experience, you can often have a lot that you want to say, but it may not all fit very easily into the 3,000 words. 3,000 words sounds like a lot, but if you're incorporating a lot of evidence, it isn't always. So I found it quite useful to use a template of having, for each paragraph, having a topic sentence, then explaining it or giving an example, and then finally reflecting on the broader significance. And I'm going to take you through an example to show you what I mean. So I'm going to show you an excerpt from a UCL response to a consultation on place-based research funding from a year or two ago. And this excerpt is from the body of the text of this response. So which is why it is out of context, but you can imagine it's one of the paragraphs in the response. So this was the topic sentence. We would welcome support from UKRI to engage with sectors that do not tend to fund R&D. And then we explain this saying, while some sectors invest substantial funding in R&D, others, such as the legal sector, do not, despite the potential to benefit significantly from R&D. So that's really explaining the point a bit further and giving an example. And then finally, reflecting on the broader significance, increasing such sectors' R&D investment could serve as an important contributor to meeting the 2.4% target. The 2.4% target is a target that the government has committed to, and what they've committed to is raising R&D funding to 2.4% of GDP by 2024-25. And including this here in this paragraph broadens out the significance of the topic sentence of the overall message to get the committee to understand, well, in this case, it wasn't a committee, but in this, to get the people who are reading this response to understand what the broader significance is in a policy context and in the context of the government's agenda. So moving on from structure to language. Now, this is the point at which I think it's really important to remember who your target audience is. And they probably don't have expertise on the topic they're looking at, because if they have expertise, they may not need to look in so much depth at this topic. And also their MPs, MPs are intentionally meant to be generalists who can cover a lot of areas. While peers may have particular areas of expertise, they may not align with the inquiry that they're looking at. So with that in mind, it's really important to make your writing as accessible and easy to read as possible, be clear and concise, and minimize jargon, or where you do feel like it's important to use a particular term, if you use it and then give a definition for what it actually means, then you can continue using the term because people can always refer back to the definition you've given at the start if they need to. Finally, I would say be explicit. What I really mean by this is that sometimes when you're reading academic texts, there can be a tendency to almost beat around the bush a bit, be quite subtle in the language, and provide evidence that you would just expect was let the reader get to a point at which they have come to the conclusion that you want them to come to. But in this context, you can't necessarily rely on that. And I would say if you want to make a point, if you want someone to come to a particular conclusion, you have to be really explicit about that conclusion that you want them to come to. And related to tailoring it to your audience with the language, think about the way you're framing your messages. So in the social care example, let's say you were responding to the point about the social care workforce, and you made a point saying, oh, the research evidence indicates X, Y, Z about the social care workforce. It's really important to take that next step and to say what the significance is in a policy context. Therefore, it's important that the government does X, Y, Z to ensure that the workforce is supported, or whatever it may be. This is not aimed at academics, this is aimed at decision makers, at policymakers, and it's important that your text reflects that. When you do make recommendations, be specific about who your recommendations are aimed at. So don't just say it's important that funding for ABC is increased. Say, it's important that this government department has more funding to deal with X, Y, Z. Or this government department takes steps, sorry, please ignore the doorbell. And one thing that can be helpful is if you think about writing your recommendations in a way that is easy to lift, so that you want this clerk or committee member reading your text to think, oh, this is great, this is really clear, really evidence-based, and we can effectively just lift this into our report. That's ideal. That's an ideal way to get what you've said incorporated. Okay, so that's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour through how to structure and write submissions to written evidence. But you might be thinking, how do you even find out where these things are happening? So I've included on this slide a couple of links. The one at the top left is to the web pages where you can see all of the names of the different committees. And I would recommend doing that because that way you can sort of cross-reference where your expertise is and what committees exist that might be relevant to that. And then you can go to the second link and sign up specifically to receive updates from those committees that you've identified are relevant to your work. So I'm just going back to our slide. We've covered what select committees do and the process of inquiries. We've explored why you might submit written evidence in the first place, and if so, how you would structure that evidence, and where you would find out about inquiries. So before we go on to this exercise, we're going to have a Q&A session. But at this stage, I want to say thank you for listening, and do feel free to get in touch. My email address is on the bottom left-hand corner. I'll now hand back to Audrey. Thank you.
Thanks, Grace. And I did see that there's a question from in the chat box, if you want to just pull that up. The question is, submit written evidence? Is it anyone, or do the select committees reach out to organizations or people they wish to hear from?
Anyone can submit written evidence. It's intended to be a way to engage with the public. And typically you'll have organizations or universities who know about these processes being the ones who proactively respond. But that doesn't mean that they are the only people that committees want to hear from. And committees are interested in hearing from a whole range of respondents, both large companies, small think tanks, universities, and also just members of the public themselves. So everyone is valued, I think, in this process. Shall I answer the second question, or is
sure, go ahead.
Do you have a sense that it matters when you submit your evidence? Is it better to submit at the beginning of the consultation in order to influence the committee, or does it not really matter? My sense is that it depends very much on the committee in question. Sometimes, as long as you submit by the deadline, it's fine. Other times, if the committee is on a short time scale, it can be helpful to submit earlier rather than later, because that can they might be at a stage where they're thinking about who to invite to give oral evidence. So if you submit your written evidence in the early stages, that might mean that you're more likely to get invited to give oral evidence, for example. Should we bring Jenny in at this stage? Because I know that Jenny may have more insight.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Thanks.
Hi.
Want to comment on either of those, Jenny?
Yeah, shall I just introduce myself quickly? So, hi everyone, I'm Jenny. I currently work at UCL in the engineering faculty, where I head up the policy impact unit, which I'll tell you more about in the second half of this session. But in a previous life, I worked for the Energy and Climate Change Select Committee in the House of Commons. So I can give you a perspective from the other side of the fence. But yeah, absolutely, completely agree with what Grace was just saying. I think it's not always obvious to the outside, but that usually the timescales on these inquiries are really short. And so as a general rule of thumb, the earlier you can get your submission in, the better, because what we typically would find was that about 90% of the submissions would come in at 1 minute to 5 on the day of the deadline, and then you have maybe a week to read all of them, whereas the ones that have come in ahead of that, you can actually, you know, take a bit more time over and kind of maybe read in a bit more depth. So yeah, so I think this, in general, the sooner the better. And I mean, I can just comment on the first question as well. It's again, as Grace said, they're absolutely open to anybody. Anybody can submit evidence. We did used to try and do our best to find people that, if they're for a particular inquiry, we would sort of do a bit of scoping and see kind of who look like they might be people who have relevant expertise, and sometimes you would contact them and just kind of advertise the fact that the inquiry was happening. But to be honest, again, it's often a question of time, and the staff don't have a huge amount of time to sort of to explore the sector quite often, and they'll be kind of moving on from one topic to another topic, a completely different topic on the next inquiry. So you can't assume that they will necessarily know about your work. So it kind of, I think, better to keep an eye out for things and be kind of put yourself forward than wait to be contacted, because, and it's not, you know, it's more down to lack of resources. It's not that the will isn't there, but I think with the best will in the world, the staff still aren't able to keep on top of all of the research that's going on that might be relevant to a particular inquiry. So I think organisations like UPenn might start to help to change that. If there are routes that people can, like people who are doing the role, like the role that I was doing, if there's a sort of single point you can go to and ask, you know, who are the academic experts that we need to hear from in this area, and there's someone who can answer that question, then that will really help. But sort of, it's quite daunting when you're looking at, you know, all of the universities across the UK and trying to figure out who are the right people to ask. It's not necessarily an easy task.
Looks like we have a third question. Thank you, Grace, really informative. I collaborated on a response to a government consultation and found it really tricky balancing responding to their questions by talking about the work we had done versus setting our work in the context of research by others. For both select committee submissions and consultations, are they looking for you to talk about just your work, or is the context appreciated? I mean, my instinctive response on this is that they will want and try to take a broader perspective than what one line of research might be able to give. So I would imagine that context would be valued. Did you want to comment on that, Jenny?
Yeah, absolutely. It would be valued. I think the question for you is whether it's that sort of, whether you've got capacity to do that. So I think they would rather hear from you than not. So if you only have the time to talk about your own research, that's still useful. If you can put it into context and talk about the wider picture, that would be extra useful. So yeah, I think it's a little bit, depends on kind of how much time you've got to put into your submission. I
Do
do
you want
the
to
next
answer the
one.
next
Yeah.
one? I think more about that than I am.
It's a great question, and it's one thing to bear in mind that responding to calls for evidence and inquiries is not the only route to engaging with select committees. So I think different committees have different approaches to how inquiries get selected, and there's lots of different ways this might happen. It depends quite a lot on the personality of the chair of that particular committee. So some of them have their own very strong ideas already about what they want to look at. Some of them will kind of seek a more kind of more input from the other committee members, the other parliamentarians who are on the committee, and take their lead from there. Probably what happens the majority of the time is that, or certainly on the committee I used to work for, was that sort of periodically every 6 months or so, we would put together a paper with some options for areas that the committee might like to consider. And then the committee would sort of discuss those and pick from there. And the way we used to put those together was by doing some kind of light touch horizon scanning type activity in the background. And that quite often involved just going along to conferences, going along to interesting workshops and seminars. And we'd quite regularly have just informal coffees with various different stakeholders. More often than not, they were either public affairs officials from private companies or from kind of campaigning NGOs. I would say the majority of the time with the sorts of people we would meet with, but there's nothing to stop you getting in touch with the staff of the select committee and saying, oh, you know, introducing yourself, telling them a bit about your area of research, why you think it might be of interest to the committee, and then offer and say, I'm, you know, very happy to meet and tell you more about my area of research or thoughts for future inquiries. And, you know, obviously you can't guarantee that they'll be able to do that because it does depend on their time availability and so on. But there's nothing to stop you from getting in touch, making contact in a proactive way. So I'd suggest that. And the final thing to say is that do keep your eyes open, because some committees, usually early on in a parliament, so after a general election, when the new committee members are setting up, some committees do, for their sort of initial inquiry, put out a call for ideas for what their inquiry should look at. So that's a really good opportunity if you can get in at that point, because for the committees, then it gives them a nice long list of things that they might come back to over the course of the next 4 or 5 years, however long that committee lasts for. So that's one. It's usually after an election that happens, but they can happen in between times as well.
And actually your response is quite relevant to the question about whether it's appropriate and beneficial to contact clerks directly to get a sense of the rationale of why the inquiry is happening and why they've chosen the particular questions in the terms of reference. I suppose that relates to what you're really saying about building a relationship with them. Yeah,
I think so. I think you know, policy engagement always comes back to relationships. So if you can build those connections with the staff, that's often a good route. And again, yeah, I don't think it hurts. It hurts to get in touch. You know, it does depend on people's time. They are quite often under a lot of time pressure, and they may not be able to fit in lots of meetings. But I think those are good questions to ask, and it does help. It helps in thinking about how you frame your response. If you can get a sense of kind of where the committee are coming from, is it because they're really kind of I don't know, if they're very critical potentially of a particular policy that they're scrutinising, or whether it's more sort of general that you get a feel for which sort of angle, which way they're likely to go. It can help you to frame your evidence in a useful way. Great. Okay. All right. So yes, hello again, everyone. So as I said before, my name's Jenny Bird and I work for the Policy Impact Unit. I don't know if everyone here is familiar or not, but just to let you know, we're a team of sort of policy intermediaries based in the Faculty of Engineering. and we collaborate with researchers to help deliver policy impact from their research. So very pleased to be here to give this session today. Thanks very much for inviting me. So session objectives for part 2 on policy briefs. So by the end of this session, hopefully you'll be able to understand when and why you might consider writing a briefing. Think you'll know features that make a high quality policy briefing and have some of the tools to produce your own high quality briefings. So first question, which is kind of to all of you, which is why write a policy briefing in order to allow them to make better informed policy decisions? Or you may be seeking to persuade them to follow a certain course of action. There's some other reasons you might do it that are a bit more kind of instrumental, I guess. So it might be a nice kind of hook that you can use. You can use it as to kind of run an event off the back of it. So, you know, a round table or a seminar or something along those lines. You might want to do it just to demonstrate your credentials in an area and to get yourself known. So it's a bit like a calling card in a way that you can then use to show policymakers that you're someone they ought to be talking to. And then obviously to extend the audience for your research beyond just the academic community.
Jenny, there were some comments in the chat.
Oh, were there? I'm so sorry, I can't see the chat when I'm in presentation.
Don't worry, they came up just as you were starting to speak. So I think we just missed the boat. One was the suggestion to influence policy in your area of expertise. The other one was a policy gives a snapshot of current affairs in the domain.
Great, yes, there you go. You said it for me. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, so some things to think about before you start writing your policy brief. So I guess the very first thing is to think about why you're doing it. What are the outcomes that you're looking for? We'll pick up on that in a moment about what some of those reasons might be. Think about who your audiences are. So who are you hoping is going to read this briefing? Think about what your indicators of success are going to be. So how are you going to know if you've achieved your goal that you set yourself? And then the final thing is just to be really aware of the policy context that you're leaping into. So on the first of those, what outcomes are you looking for? I know there's loads of information on this slide and we can share the slides afterwards and you can kind of read the detail at your leisure. But to kind of at the headline level, just worth bearing in mind that there's all sorts of different types of policy impact. When we talk about policy impact in a very general way a lot of the time, and it's just worth remembering there's all sorts of different ways that research evidence is used in policy making. And so it's worth thinking through where your research fits, where it might be useful and what you hope the outcome will be. So yeah, at the sort of headline level, it might be helping to shape the policy agenda. So this might be new and emerging issues that policymakers are not really thinking about at the moment. So getting something new on their radar and starting that debate and that public discussion on that issue. Again, you might be seeking to influence individual policymakers, they're trying to help shape their attitudes or behaviours in a particular area. Contributing to the development of policy or change in policy. So this is for areas where it might be an issue that is already on the agenda and that politicians and policymakers are already talking about, and then helping to make debates and decisions in those areas better informed. And then at sort of at the legislative level, it might be, this is a much more kind of detailed change that you'd be looking for, but looking for amendments or changes in legislation that's going through Parliament, for example. Then there's sort of thinking about what happens in the delivery side of things. So thinking about how policies might be implemented and how that could happen in an effective way. So, you know, for example, in delivery of public services and so on. So that might be a different take. And then the final one is you might really be seeking to build networks and coalitions or to join existing networks that are relevant to your particular area. Okay, so who are policymakers? I know that you touched on this in some of the earlier sessions, so I won't dwell on this. Sorry, just to get my diagram up. So yeah, so I think we kind of often think about the visible and formal decision makers. They're sort of the ones that immediately come to mind when we talk about policymakers. But just to say, don't forget the influencers as well. That sort of pale pink circle in particular, who can play a very important role in shaping the direction of policy, and sometimes your best route to those central group might be via one of those sort of informal or influencing groups on the outside. And so yeah, so that's groups like NGOs, private sector organisations, think tanks. These sorts of groups can all be very influential. Okay, and then just thinking about the policy context. So Grace mentioned this in her talk, and just to kind of reiterate the point, it's really, really important to know what's going on in policy in the area that you're engaging with, because if you don't know kind of what the debates are, what the big questions are, what the arguments are, it's really hard to write your policy briefing, to frame it in a way that is going to feel useful to someone who's on the other side. So if there are big questions happening and policymakers, there's a big problem that policymakers are trying to tackle, if you can shape your policy briefing so it starts off by saying, we know this is a problem, and here's how our research can help you to find a solution to that problem, it's going to feel much more kind of immediate and useful to the reader than something that perhaps is that stands kind of outside of that context. So I think people who are kind of experienced in policy engagement you sort of pick this stuff up through osmosis really over time. If it's not something you've done before and it feels a bit daunting, there are some good places I would recommend to start that, to have a look, to start that process. So, oh yeah, here we go. So a really good one is the House of Commons Library, and they publish all of their briefings that they prepare for MPs on the web, so they're freely available to anyone, and they're really good summaries, because not only do they tell you kind of what's going on now, they usually will provide a bit of a history of the policy, so what's been tried in the past and what's worked, what hasn't worked, and they usually provide a good overview of who's saying what. Select committee, and they'll also usually include a summary of kind of media stuff, what's been happening in the media, and other kind of influential stakeholders who've been vocal on an issue. So if you can find a recent library briefing on your topic, then that's like jackpot really, because you can get it really quickly that way. They're really, really useful. Other places that I would suggest good starting points are post notes, which I'm guessing people quite likely familiar with. So Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, they also produce these briefings, and they're very short, so they don't take long to read. Obviously, it makes sense to have a look whether the government itself has published any documents. There might be strategies or policy documents or things called green papers or white papers that are worth. And again, they'll all be available on the website, and it's worth kind of familiarising yourself with any recent ones to get a sense of what the government is thinking in that particular area. And then finally, of course, just kind of keeping on top of current affairs and paying attention to what's in the news and who's talking about what. Okay, so then thinking about what actually makes a good policy briefing. I include this quote because I just think it's quite a nice, well, it acts as a bit of a reminder, I suppose, that so it's written by someone called Duncan Green, who is he has a sort of dual role. He's an academic at the LSE, I think, but he also works for Oxfam, so he has a lot of experience kind of on both sides. And he sort of talking from his experience over the years, sort of made this comment that a distressing amount of academic research on aid, which is obviously his area, treats practitioners as fools or knaves or both. Try assuming that practitioners are actually smarter than you are, but don't have the time to do all that thinking and reading. So you're providing a valuable service. And I think that's quite a helpful mindset to have when you go into writing your policy briefing, thinking, okay, I want to provide something that's going to be a useful service for the reader of this. And again, sort of assuming that they're an intelligent audience is a good starting point. Yeah, so I think most of these points we've touched on. So clear structure with a clear title, summary, policy context, as I mentioned kind of earlier. Obviously, including your research findings or research insights actually might be another way of thinking about it. So again, trying to think about what is useful from your research from the policymaker's perspective. And key references and contact details. So I think everybody mentioned those. And then just again thinking a bit about how it looked. Certainly in the group I was listening into, that there was some discussion about some of them were more visually appealing than others. It's interesting to hear. I think there's a mixed views on the third policy briefing, the use of colour there. I think some people like that, some people really didn't like that. So interesting. Reactions on that one. So do think about kind of how you can make it look appealing. Do think about using things like figures, charts, diagrams that can convey information in a kind of in a visual way. And yes, I think we mentioned this point as well. So use headings and subheadings to make it easy to navigate the document and for people to they can kind of quickly get an overview of what the content covers. And yes, this is from another guide. I've put the link at the bottom, and that's also in the notes. It's quite a useful kind of guide to writing a policy brief. So kind of rules of thumb, I suppose. Keep it short and to the point, as we all know. Really focus on, think about what are the implications. It's that kind of so what question. So, you know, it's not about things that are interesting, it's about things that are going to be useful to the reader. So really think about what's the meaning you're trying to convey. It needs to be understandable, so plain English. Try and write in short, clear sentences, minimize the use of jargon. Visually appealing, as we've just said. Obviously, it needs to be accurate, and I think quality control is really important, actually, with policy briefs, and it's sometimes a step that gets missed. And, you know, I think you don't need to do a full peer review process, but it is worth getting someone else to review it before you publish it, and to just make sure that you've really got it. Everything is kind of accurate in there. And then, I know I sound a bit like a broken record on this one, but contextualize. So really just being clear in your own head about how it fits into the wider policy landscape. So hopefully you sort of feel everyone has a bit of a sense now of what a policy briefing might look like, what it might contain. But then the next thing is, what do you do with it once you've written it? And I would say what you don't do is just put it on a website and then hope people will find it, because they won't. So it's really important to think about, hopefully you've identified who your audience is before you started writing it. So then think about, how am I going to get it in front of those people and make sure that they read it. So there's all sorts of different things you can do to disseminate a policy briefing. some suggestions include sending targeted emails to individuals with obviously with a link and an attachment of your briefing. You can promote it via social media. So Twitter and LinkedIn, we find in particular are quite useful for this. Twitter, particularly for a policy audience. LinkedIn, I think, is possibly a bit better for an academic audience, although maybe that's changing. You could write a blog about your briefing. And there's lots of places that would host that. So obviously UCL Public Policy have a policy blog, so you could write a piece there, or you could look to see if any external organisations run blogs, and who you might host a blog from you, and that can be quite a good way of reaching a sort of specialist policy audience on an area. If you know of a sort of well-established blog that has a large readership, writing a piece and then linking to your briefing from there can be quite a good way of getting it out there and getting it read. So obviously it needs to be available to people, so they do publish it on the web, so that people can find it. And if you can take steps to make sure that you've optimized it for search engines so that it does, when people are Googling, your briefing comes high up the list, and that is good. Quite another common thing to do is to run an event or a webinar that's sort of based around your briefing, maybe invite a couple of external speakers to give a response, that sort of thing. And then in some cases, you might want to think about whether you use media work as well. Obviously, well, this goes for all of them. I'm not necessarily suggesting you do all of these things for every single policy briefing. You need to pick and choose depending on who exactly it is you're trying to reach. But certainly for some of these, it can be a good opportunity to write a press release where you've got a new briefing coming out. So that's a reason to write a press release. And if you can get media coverage, then again, it just drives people to come and read your briefing. It kind of piques their interest, and then they'll hopefully come to you to find out more. Okay. So we have another activity now, which is thinking about how you might approach writing a good covering email to go with your policy briefing that you're sending out to policymakers. Just in summary, I'm pretty sure we covered all of these points. So yeah, thinking about what goes in the subject line, sending it to a named person rather than to whom it may concern. Sort of making it clear to that person how it relates to them and their role. So in this case, saying that it might be, acknowledging the fact that they work for Interpol. Highlighting the key finding from the research. I think actually, maybe going back to what Rachel was saying, it could even be, pulled out and put in bold to make that extra clear. Referring to the media work to show that this is important and worth taking time over. Including links to the briefing, and then including your contact details. So yeah, I think we pretty much got all of those from the discussion, which is great. Okay, so really that's pretty much it from me. Just to do I guess a quick summary at the end. So key things to remember before you start. Think about, why are you writing it? Who is your audience? What are you hoping to achieve? What is the policy context? And what does success look like? And how will you measure it? And just to say on that point, I have included in the handout for this some examples of indicators that you might use. I mean, it's not an exhaustive list by any means, but just to give a sense. We haven't really got time to go through that in this session today, but if you want to take a look at that in your own time afterwards, it might kind of give you some prompts in thinking about how you can tell if your policy briefing has achieved its desired goals or not. And then thinking about the policy briefing itself, it needs to be concise, focused, understandable, contextually focused and accurate. And then you need to have a dissemination strategy for what you do with the briefing once you've written it, to make sure that the right people, it gets to the right people, and hopefully they will want to read it when it gets to them. So that is all from me. You'll probably be glad to hear. If anybody wants to get in touch after the session, particularly if there is anyone based in engineering and you're interested to find out more about my team, do drop me an email. My details are here, and we have a web page as well if you're interested to know more about what we do. So yeah, I'm going to.
And so yeah, Jenny, thank you so much for going through the policy brief session. I know that we have Isabel on the call who is able to provide a little bit of insight into sort of the government's perspective in terms of what people in government are looking for from a policy brief. So Isabel, do you want to sort of just give us a little insight into the work that you've been involved with?
Sure. Thanks, Audrey. So just as a bit of background to me, so I'm a public policy engagement facilitator at UCL Public Policy. But so before then, I did my PhD at UCL as well, and in that I did a UKRI policy internship at the Government Office of Science. So Go Science is effectively the science hub of government. It's the government chief scientific advisors department, so where Patrick Vallance sits, is his department. And so I worked there actually for a year in the end. And when I was there, I sort of wrote some briefings. I mean, I mostly was working on the areas of research interest. So an effort from central government departments to publish their research questions and engage with the academic community with them. But I would say, so during my time, I also supported some select committee briefings for Patrick, and a couple of briefings, sort of meeting briefings and topic briefings. And I think, yeah, I mean, a lot of it's already been covered in what Jenny has recommended, and also from the discussions, lots of things were raised that I would only echo again. And kind of say that definitely from my experience, being clear and brief, and having your key points really up front and center is, I mean, because a lot of the time that's all that they read. So I would say from my experience, structure and highlighting the key points right from the beginning make for a much more effective briefing. I guess I would also, again, this was talked about, but knowing your audience is so important. The language that you use and being able to frame it in a way that is relevant to what your target audience is interested in at that time. So being aware of what their priorities are and where this might fit into the cycle of the policy that's being developed, for example, is really, really important. So again, I know that Jenny's talked about that already. I also wanted to maybe highlight the importance of thinking about the timing that you might want to be contacting people. So with those emails and asking, highlighting a policy briefing that you might have just written, being aware of other things that might be going on, which will mean that your email will be lost, won't be looked at. If there's like a big spending review's just been, just come out or something, then they might not notice your email. But if you are good with timing, then it will kind of get across their table, much more likely to be across their table. So I think that's also something that I learned, which was sort of being aware of other things that are going on and how you can be strategic with your approaches. Yeah, so I think, how can you find out what's going on? That's a really good question. There's lots of different ways that you can find out what's going on. I guess having said that, sometimes it's difficult to know exactly when certain things are going to be published because they don't always make that explicit. But I don't know if there's anyone else, so like Audrey and Jenny, if you have any other tips for this, but I mean, just sort of being subscribed to like select committees and things like that can kind of raise when things might be coming out. I don't know, how else could you have your sort of finger on the pulse, Jenny?
Well, I was just thinking, so Isabel and I were doing a training session yesterday, and one of our speakers suggested Twitter. And I think that's actually is a good suggestion. So if you're not already kind of following people in the policy world, then that's quite a good place to start. And you can kind of build up who you follow in an organic way. But you find that there are kind of quite a lot of debates and discussions that happen there. So it can be a quick.
You're completely right. I raised that as well, saying actually that's such a useful way to find out who's having the discussions, who are the key players that you could be approaching, who'd be interested in what you're writing a policy briefing about, and being aware of, because there'll be, I guess, hints on Twitter about when things might be coming out as well. So yeah, definitely that's a really good tool.
And most of the select committees and each of the government's departments will have their own newsletters. So if there's departments or committees that are relevant to your specific area, you can subscribe to their newsletters. And that way they send often weekly updates of just the inquiries. They also might have pieces written by the MP, so you can see what people are interested in. Also, there's a publication called The House, which has articles and blog pieces written by MPs. So that's a really good way to see what people, like which MPs actually feel strongly and what their interests are in.
And I would add, make use of facilities like UCL Public Policy and sign up to their newsletter, because people like Audrey will do a lot of the hard work for you and will kind of highlight to make clear when there are new inquiries coming out and new consultations that might be relevant. So do talk to Audrey and the team in UCL Public Policy, because that could be another shortcut and might save you a bit of effort as well.
Yeah, definitely. That's the UCL Public Policy newsletter always highlights sort of different events that that's really fantastic. Go to and you can build up a network there. But events and calls for like grants and things that are going out and things that you can take part in, and different evidence that calls for evidence that we might be contributing to. So yeah, definitely sign up for the newsletter. It's really, really useful. We put in a lot of work to it. So.
I've included the link to our newsletter in the chat. And I've also included a link to next Tuesday's Writing for a Public Audience Masterclass session. So it's happening at the same time, 2 till 4. And it's when Jenny was talking about ways to disseminate your policy briefs. This will cover exactly that in more detail. So how to use Twitter, blogs, and the media, print media. So it's sort of a really handy sort of tie on from today's topics. There's a question asking how long it takes to write a brief.
Yeah, it's a difficult one to answer. I think the thing that sometimes takes more time than you might expect is the bit that comes first about finding out what the policy context is. And that can actually, it's worth investing time in that, because you'll get something much more useful at the end. But that can take, several weeks, maybe even a month, to really kind of get your head around what's happening, especially if you want to go and talk to people and maybe have a few meetings. So, it depends. But then I think going back to what Isabel was saying just a minute ago about timing being important, that is the other, it's sort of finding the balance between those two things, because getting the timing right is really important factor in whether your briefing will have any impact or not. And if you take too long over it and you miss the opportunity, then you almost may as well not bother. So it sort of takes as long as it needs to take. If you have a very short deadline, there's a debate coming up next week, and you can throw something together in a couple of days, probably have to in order to meet that deadline. But if there isn't that kind of time constraint and you really want to do a really good job, I mean, as a rule of thumb, actually, so those post notes that we shared earlier, so they're usually written by researchers who are on secondment to Parliament, and they get three months to produce one of those. So that's full-time 3 months. And obviously they might not necessarily, they're starting from a point probably where they don't have any prior knowledge, so they've got to do the research. But if you want a rough figure, that might be a good guide. I don't know what you think, Isabel. Maybe you've got some other experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think the post note ones, you're right, it's about 3 months for one of those. But I think that, yeah, you're totally right, Jenny. It depends how long you have to do it in. If you need it to be done much quicker, then you can pull it together. So, I mean, I guess I'm trying to pull together some evidence for evidence summaries for the call for evidence from the Environmental Audit Committee, and so I know that the deadline for that is in January. Although the sooner the better. So it's it's hard to just definitely say how long it will take, but around that amount of time usually.